So today we're going to talk about the psychedelic molecule DMT, N,N-dimethyltryptamine. It's one of the most precarious molecule psychedelics out there for so many different reasons. It's also gained a lot of notoriety and fame over the last couple years. Mostly for this hypothesis of that it is a gateway to another dimension of extreme intelligent beings that are trying to pass down information. And although I absolutely love that hypothesis, and I hope that it stands the test of time, and that is the hypothesis that we work with, because that is extremely interesting and very cool, much cooler than the hypothesis that I am going to present today. But the only big issue I have with that is that it's not really testable, and it also just doesn't make that much sense from an evolutionary perspective. And what we'll go over today within this talk is the idea of the neuroscience, evolution, origins of life, all these things that we have foundational research on can start to build the premise of what DMT, the molecule, does for humanity, for the world, and just kind of exploring that through a very scientific lens, but also through a lens of being an experienced user of DMT and psychedelics, and understanding the symbolism and the entities and what's going on, and just trying to bring all these ideas together in a very symbiotic, science-backed way, so that we can study these things. That's the one thing I really like about my hypothesis, is that it is something that we can actually have tangible, objective, and subjective research on to kind of either disprove it and shift our attention more towards the alien intelligence hypothesis, or prove it and turn it into a theory that we continue to test and test and test. So the hypothesis that I've come up with is that DMT is an interface from birth to consciousness and death to non-consciousness. And I'll go through the research of DMT during the birth process, during near-death experiences, all the research that we have to kind of back that up, and also how the entities align with this theory of DMT being released through birth, and how that kind of turns on the conscious experience for us. So, that's one of the things, the hard problem. Consciousness remains a central challenge to neuroscience. And there's so many things like dream states, imagination, are still incompletely explained. Even psychedelics and near-death experiences, for the reasons of not being able to do the research on those, and maybe not having the tools, are hard to explain as well. And we need to dig deeper into the neurochemical substrates that can bridge the biology and subjective awareness. So one of the things with DMT is that it's both one of the most potent naturally occurring psychedelics and an endogenous compound found in mammals, and including human beings. And decades of speculation, its biological function remains unclear. So what we're going to propose today is a novel theoretical model called the birth echo hypothesis, which posits that DMT acts as a biochemical interface, enabling the brain to access a more fundamental layer of consciousness, particularly during transitional moments such as birth and death. And even to get a little bit more philosophical, maybe that it is the switch of consciousness. And we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more. So again, this is highly speculative, theoretical, but we're going to go over the science and try to back that up as much as possible. So the hypothesis suggests that the archetypal features of the DMT experience, intense visual symbolism, entity encounters, ego dissolution, a sensation of returning, are not hallucinations in the conventional sense, but symbolic reactivations of deeply encoded neurodevelopmental patterns. Specifically, I'm going to argue that DMT experience may recapitulate the perceptual and affective environment of the birth process, during which the infant's brain is flooded with DMT, uh, that can create this novel sensory input prior to the consolidation of selfhood and autobiographical memory. And this interpretation is also supported by compelling neurophysiological parallels between the neonatal brain and the brain under psychedelics. Both exhibit increased entropy, reduced integrity of the default mode network, elevated cross-modal connectivity, suggesting synesthesia, and minimal narrative self-structure. Right? The implication is that DMT may serve as a neurochemical threshold molecule, biologically timed to modulate transitions in and out of structured consciousness. So building on this framework, we're going to incorporate insights from cell assembly theory, the origins of life literature, that if life is best understood not as a property of individual molecules, but systems capable of storing and transmitting information, then DMT, due to its structural simplicity, ubiquity in living organisms, and capacity to modulate high-level cortical integration, may have served an unprecedented evolutionary function. Synthesized in just 2 steps from tryptophan, DMT could have acted as a primitive signaling molecule in protocellular assemblies, scaffolding chemical complexity in the same way it modulates neural network entropy in the human brain today. Its role in mediating transitions between order and chaos, between unconsciousness and awareness, may reflect an evolutionarily conserved interface between molecular structure and conscious experience. So rather than proposing that DMT creates consciousness, I'm suggesting that it may facilitate access to deeper, possibly fundamental layer of reality in which consciousness is a primary feature, whether viewed through the lens of idealism, neutral monism, or a complexity science. The hypothesis invites new empirical and philosophical approaches to studying these altered states. And uniting psychedelic neuroscience, developmental psychology, evolutionary biology, and conscientious theory, we're trying to reframe DMT not simply as a hallucinogen, but as a bridge, biochemical, symbolic, and ontological between life, death, and mystery of awareness. So when we're thinking about the trip in and of itself, one thing that always comes up is that the ubiquity of everybody kind of having the same trip. And we want to ask ourselves, well, why is that? Why is that the case? And the alien intelligence hypothesis says that because we're getting kind of pulled into a dimension, and it's the same dimension for everyone, where they're giving us these technologies. But my pushback on that is there's 2 things that happen in every human's life that is ubiquitous around the world, regardless where you came from. And that's birth, and that's death. And when we think about birth, we want to think about within the DMT trip is that it starts off very dark, and then you start to get pulled into these fractals and geometries, and then you get this breakthrough experience. So with the idea that when we ingest or inhale or intravenously consume DMT, I propose that DMT is taking us back to the memories of birth, of those first initial moments of birth, and then also until our brain starts to develop the default mode network and our sense of self. And we'll get into all that neuroscience and why that's supported. But from the experience itself, right, it starts off dark, and then it starts to build, and then you get this breakthrough experience, which is very equivalent to this idea of in utero, and then going through the birthing process and breaking through. And then when you break through, we have these entities that come about. And before we get into the entities, let's kind of take a step back and think about birth and death, and how DMT plays a role, and how evolutionarily like this starts to make sense. So research has shown that the enzyme that synthesizes DMT, indolylthylamine N methyltransferase, INMT for short, is something that is elevated in the activity it has elevated activity in the placenta. Research has been done to show that, and some research has also been suggested that it may be necessary to have these high levels for pregnancy success. So if you can imagine, as the birthing process takes place, you get this big flush of DMT, and this is something that we could potentially study in the mom. Obviously, for ethical reasons, it would be very hard. But my theory behind it is that there's going to be a huge release of DMT, potentially from the mom into the placenta, and then that's when you start to get this experience of dark going to light and fractal patterns, and then you get to this breakthrough. So you're flooded with DMT, and you break through, and then you get held by the doctor, the nurses, which I think is these entities that are these insect entities that are kind of cold, somewhat benevolent, but never really do you harm. They're the ones that are operating on you. They're the ones that are operating on your brain, operating on this or that, tearing you down and bringing you up to rebirth. Sounds very similar to doctors, nurses, midwives. And some of the pushback you'll get is, how does this transcend through time? Because, we've had people having their subjective experience historically documented, talking about the little people and talking about the insects. But we know that the birthing process has been the same since we became bipedal humans. And there's always going to be a shaman. There's always going to be a deliverer. There's always going to be midwives, ritualistic experiences around the birth. So this idea that these entities, it makes sense because everyone has that same experience of birth and having these processes. And then research has also found that DMT is found in developing rat brains up to at least 40 days of age throughout the whole brain, and speculated that DMT's neuroplastigenic effects may be involved from birth for neonatal development, maintenance, and repair. So when we look at the birth process, right, the onset of light responsiveness in the womb comes late into the third trimester, and that may represent a sensory first contact experience for the fetus, possibly modulated or enhanced by endogenous neuromodulators like melatonin, DMT, monoamines. And then if the DMT release coincides with or facilitates sensory integration at birth, visual processing may become a key component of the archetypal DMT imagery, right? So the thing that you have to put aside is that we put the vision and the brain of the baby into our physical and perceptual world, and we just expect it to see exactly what we're seeing. But you can imagine if it gets flooded with DMT, and it has, through fMRI and EEG research, it has the same kind of brain lighting up and neural connectivity that people have on psychedelics, that when you come out, you're going to have these crazy visions of who's taking care of you. They're not going to look like humans. They're not going to look like people. They're not going to look like regular nurse beds or things. That they're going to look crazy through the DMT release. And because of that, because of the intensification and emotion, sensory data, the intenseness of coming out, that the idea that we're going to be able to reconstruct that memory is just not going to be there, right? It's like when you go to the DMT state, the fact that you think you're going to remember anything that's in there is because everything's coming at you, right? So you're born, you're pushed into this world, and everything you see in this DMT state is all new to you. So you're trying to figure it out. You're trying to figure out what another human is. You're trying to figure out what this medical device is. You're trying to figure out what these shamanistic experiences are, right? So you have to put yourself in that situation, and you're getting inundated, which means that your memory consolidation is just gone. There's no way you're going to be able to remember that. And the research shows that, like, between the age of 18 to 24 months, that kids lack that memory, that capability to store those memories. And that's because as the default mode network starts to form, and you start to lose that DMT sense, you start to get a realistic idea of the physical world. Then you start to consolidate a sense of self, and you start to consolidate these memories because it's not being flooded in at you anymore. So that kind of goes over the birthing process and why DMT relates to that. But also to bookend this, right? We want to talk about these near-death experiences. And one of the features that have been reported in these experiences, subjective, obviously, is that you have these feelings of inner peace, traveling through a dark region or a tunnel-like experience, bright lights, out-of-body experience, communication with sentient beings, and entering into another realm of existence. You also get the idea that you're getting inundated with all your memories, which has been shown in, theologian times. When you look at, like, the Bible, and they talk about when you go to heaven, you have to look through your book and answer for the things that you've done, right? That's that idea of these memories being flooded back into you. And when we talk about that, right, from that near-death experience, right, even though DMT is there, and we also get these structures of actual memories. And that's because we already have this physical world in mind and imprinted. So that's the difference between the DMT experience towards death and the DMT experience at birth. Is at birth, we don't have any idea of what this physical world, this physical structure looks like. We have to create it through prediction errors of what the brain does. So these experiences are very similar to experiences induced by DMT. And there was research conducted by Dean in 2019 where they monitored DMT levels in rat brain following induced cardiac arrest, and discovered a significant rise in DMT levels with and without the pineal gland. So the idea is that as we get into these, say, intense catastrophic states of birth and of death, we get this release of DMT. And why would that be the case? Why would we get this release of DMT? And one of the very unique things about DMT that is different from all the other psychedelics is that it binds to the sigma-1 receptor, which is an intracellular protein located at the endoplasmic reticulum that modulates calcium signaling and cell survival pathways. So DMT is an endogenous ligand for sigma-1 receptors in mammals, indicating a potential use of DMT to naturally activate this receptor under certain conditions, like asphyxia, like birth, like etc. Right? These extreme conditions. And what it does is it's been shown to its activation has been identified to protect cells from oxidative stress, regulate neuroinflammation, facilitate neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. There's been speculation that dying brains may produce a rush of DMT that may be neuroprotective and ameliorating the damage of oxygen deprivation, while also binding to 5-HT2A receptors, causing a profound conscious experience, right? So evolutionarily speaking, right, this would be beneficial at birth to protect the brain, to protect from the extreme experience of going through a black tunnel and then all of a sudden coming out, right? So it gives you a profound conscious experience. So you don't have that trauma built in. And the same thing with near-death experiences, right? It's our last protective mechanism that can keep the brain alive. So if we do not pass away, then it is a neuroprotective savior of sorts, right? So the massive bursts of DMT can trigger that hyper-associative memory retrieval, like we talked about. And it's that essentially it's like a fractal expansion of memory circuits resulting in a life review. And from a neuroscience perspective, extreme stress and neuromodulation, possibly via DMT and other neurochemicals like endorphins, might push the brain into a state where memory traces fire rapidly, globally, and given the impression of seeing one's life flash before one's eyes. Psychedelic science has documented that under drugs like psilocybin, personal autobiographical memories can surface with remarkable vividness and novel emotional contexts, facilitating therapeutic breakthroughs. Right, so that's kind of the idea of why DMT evolutionarily could be advantageous for us, and also why DMT is something that creates these same experiences over and over again for everyone, regardless of where they came from. So that can explain that concept as well. It can explain the darkness, get into the geometries, the fractals, and then pushing, breaking through, and then all the entities. And that's what we're going to get into next, right? Is these entities. So we have these insect-like entities that are kind of malevolent and kind of they're more standoffish, right? So you think of a doctor, right? A doctor is there to receive, is there to do whatever it has to do to get the baby to be alive, healthy, everything. Not a lot of emotion, not a lot of excitement. So that could be this supreme intelligence that they talk about. This, and then why would it be insects? And we know that archetypally, insects, reptiles, that's something that gets passed down as protective mechanisms, so that we don't, so that when we do see them, we know that, okay, they're poisonous, or they could be dangerous, or they could be, right? And research kind of backs that up. If you look at research in mammals or in rats, right, they can put cat hair in a rat cage, and the rat can smell it, and the rat knows that, like, okay, this is a bad hair. This could be our death. Because when they put a dog hair in there, they don't have the same reaction, right? So we have this internal, as Jung said, archetypes of good and bad already built in as survival mechanisms for us, which is extremely evolutionarily important, right? So then we talk about these elves, right? And what can these elves be? But before we do that, the insects, we also have insects that are kind of putting us back together, right? Nurses, midwives, all those things make sense. Then we have the elves, and the elves, from when I've done DMT, I always thought of the elves as like, these guys are just distracting me, right? They're distracting me from like the information that I really want to see. They're distracting me. They're just showing off. They're just showing off, continuously showing me like all these things, like, look at this, look what I can do, look what I can do. And the way I interpret that with this birthing process is that these elves can be toys that the parents use. So imagine birth, the dad, the nurses, whoever, they have these toys that they're already putting out. And we know that prehistorically that we found, as far as 30,000 years ago, children's toys and artifacts, miniature figurines. So we know that this childhood experience of getting small figures waved in front of us to make them happy, to make them laugh, which is why we have this benevolent feeling towards them. And then we talk about like the elves going into the chest, right? Think about like, what's one of the most common things that parents do to the babies, right? They wave their fingers and they go in and they try to make it laugh. They try to make them, parents and everyone around the baby is always trying to make the baby laugh. And if it's a retrieval of memories from that situation, that could explain why about 95% of the DMT trips are positive, benevolent ones, and very, very small percentage are negative induced ones. And then we also know that through ritualistic experiences, but also through common day modern experiences, that as soon as a baby's born, everyone floods, everyone's dancing, everyone is trying to look at me, watch what I can do, trying to get the baby's attention, right? Elves do the same thing. And then we have this idea of this mother spirit, this thing that's guiding you along throughout the whole process. And that's can be simply explained as your mom, right? As soon as all the chaos, all the elves, right? Your mom's always there. Your mom's always holding you. Your mom's always protecting you, feeding you, everything, right? So that explains potentially. Remember, this is all potential. That mother spirit feeling, and then this idea of been here before, realer than real. Well, it's because we have been there before. If it is an expression of our memories of birth until we form this sense of self, until we form this solid, rigid, start to create order in our brain, it makes sense. And then supreme intelligence, like, again, think about it. If you're flooded with DMT and it can potentially stay in you for days, weeks, what are the parents constantly doing? What are you constantly doing? You're learning the world. You're learning, oh, this person has a square. It's showing me a square. What is a square? It could be this. It could be this geometry, right? It could be all these things. So you're constantly being inundated with this learning process of, absolutely, all I knew was this dark hole, and now I'm trying to figure out this world, and it just seems way beyond any intelligence that I could even muster. Um, so that's kind of my thoughts on the entities. And I think that, from a symbolic representation perspective, babies have long been a part of human culture or life. The creation of small toys indicates that adults recognize their capacity for symbolic play and sensory engagement. The archetypal resonance, right? The artifact suggests that early humans created objects to evoke sensory joy and imaginative interaction, parallel the symbolic with the archetypal imagery seen in DMT experiences. And then the universality of it, the ubiquity of infant playthings ranging from rattles to miniature models to the birthing process, right? It all makes sense. And then we touched on this a little bit, but like, why don't we have clear memories until like 18 to 24 months? And the thought process is that during birth, you get this surge of DMT and it promotes a state of synesthetic, unfiltered sensory consciousness. So, and it's a necessary mode for the first contact with embodiment. And it is so the early state is hyper connected, multisensory. There is research that proposes the theory that all kids are born with this ability to have this synesthesia, where, and if you've done a psychedelic trip, you know that this occurs as well, where music has, you can see music, you can hear color, you can do all these things, right? And what the research kind of hints at, this theory, is that all kids are born with that, but as we create this reality, everything gets pruned away and pruned away. But some adults still have synesthesia, and some adults still have this ability to see those things. So it doesn't always get pruned away, but the majority of it gets pruned away because if you think about it, we have to begin to start interacting with this physical world as it is. But we do get this hyper connected, multisensory synesthesia like, which is shown in babies, and it's also shown in people that are having the psychedelic experience. Symbolically rich, fractal, chaotic, poorly suited for memory consolidation due to its high entropy. Right, so we know that psychedelics, especially DMT, but pretty much all psychedelics, create this high level of entropy, which is uncertainty within the brain. And because DMT is so fast acting and so much entropy, that the idea that we're going to be able to consolidate memories from that experience is ill-fated unless we tap back into it by smoking or intravenously consuming DMT. So these babies, they end up developing neural pruning, myelination, and the default mode network maturation gradually filters this unstructured perception into the constrained, linear, social adaptive model of the world we call ordinary consciousness, right? This transition could involve pruning of excess synaptic connections, reduction in 5-HT2A expression and sigma-1 signaling, loss of access to the DMT-like state under extreme conditions. And the plausibility, like the scientific plausibility of it, is that the theory is that all infants are born synesthetic, and the evidence would say that the strong connectivity between sensory cortices, infants' responses to cross-modal stimuli, link in brightness and pitch, gradual pruning of cross-sensory connections by 2 to 4 years of age, and DMT may facilitate early synesthetic states, right? Visuals turn to tactile, auditory to spatial, emotional to symbolic. It induces fractal, synesthetic, and archetypal experiences in adults, suggesting that its early presence could amplify intramodal neural signaling in neonates. And the high entropy state hinders our ability to create episodic memory. So poor self-other distinction, unconsolidated time perception, immature hippocampal function, and low theta coherence, high plasticity but low declarative memory fidelity. And if DMT contributes to this, that's why we have the lack of early autobiographical memory, dream-like qualities of early perception. And the pruning comes around like 2 to 3 years. The default mode network comes online, so you have this sense of self. Everyone talks about kids develop this sense of self by 2 years old, and that's when the memories start to form and their identity starts to form, and it starts to create more order in our life, right? And that's why if you look at the entropic hypothesis by Dr. Robin Carr-Harris, where the reason psychedelics work is because they try to create more uncertainty in a brain that's trying to constantly always be ordered, and too much order can create mental health disorders. And then language acquisition skyrockets, ego emerges, right? And this aligns with the loss of access to the chaotic synthetic DMT mode, increase in filtering of sensory experiences into narrative selfhood, better memory formation. All right, so and like I said, the fun thing about this hypothesis is that it is testable, right? So certain things we could do. We can measure cross-modal cortical activity in neonates versus DMT adults. We can track INMT, DMT levels across development, see if endogenous DMT declines as pruning and myelation increase. We can compare subjective DMT experience to infant behavior, qualitatively map themes, chaos, lights, tactical visual blending. The neuroscience of the trip, right? So what does the neuroscience say? fMRI, EEG data on newborns and infants, it's limited and methodologically constrained due to ethical, technical, and physiological challenges, but it does provide important insight, right? So fMRI data on newborn and infants, rest in state fMRI studies have shown that newborns exhibit structured functional connectivity in the brains within days after birth. One of the first fMRI studies in newborns showed early emergence of default mode-like network connectivity at rest, although immature compared to adults. Longitudinal studies demonstrate progressive maturation of large-scale brain networks. So while newborns don't have a fully developed default mode network, proto-default mode network structures are observable and strengthen with age, especially after 1 year. Sensory processing fMRI studies in neonates have shown robust auditory and visual cortex activation in response to sound and light stimuli, even in sleeping infants. Somatosensory response are also observed in newborn fMRI using touch stimuli. And then what does the EEG data tell us? That delta brushes burst of high frequency activity nested in delta waves. These are dominant in the latal, fetal, and early neonatal period and are thought to reflect immature thalamocortical connections. Spontaneous activity transients, right? Discontinuous bursts that gradually become more continuous and synchronized as the infant matures, right? So that synchronicity is that order of the brain. And then sleep-wake states are detectable within the first week with active REM-like and quiet sleep distinguishable, conscious and related EEG patterns. So EEG in 5-month-olds are found neural markers of perceptual consciousness similar to adults, including late cortical potentials in response to mass images. Studies in newborns as young as 2 days old show event-related potentials to speech and emotional prosody, indicating rudimentary auditory recognition and affective processing. So how is this relevant to the echo birth hypothesis? So the existence of functional sensory networks and early proto default mode network patterns support the idea that newborns are already in a state of rudimentary, unfiltered consciousness, perhaps more entropic and multisensory than adults. The delta brushes and SATs might be electrophysiological signatures of high entropy, chaotic neural state consistent with the model of DMT associated sensory flooding at birth. And the absence of strong default mode network coherence and immature hippocampal cortical circuits aligns with the lack of memory encoding and fluid sense of self, possibly mirroring the DMT state. So some of the neurodynamics of this entropic brain hypothesis that we touched on, it is trying to create more entropy in the brain, which helps with the mental health disorders. So it's this kind of like uncertainty, spontaneous activity. So there's less prediction and top-down control, more bottom-up sensory and emotional processing, more flexible, chaotic, and associative cognition. So this description also applies to newborns. Frontal cortex is underdeveloped. Thalamocortical feedback loops are immature. Brain dynamics are exploratory and unfiltered. So both the psychedelic brain and the neonatal brain exist in a low-order, high-entropy state where meaning is fluid and the ego is either undeveloped or deconstructed. So when we're looking at DMT consumption and the hippocampus, because one of the pushbacks that we get with the alien intelligence hypothesis is that there's no way that this could be coming from memory or hallucinations. But what we do know is that DMT does interact with the hippocampus 5-HT2A receptors, and it's a potent agonist, which is expressed especially in the CA1 and CA3 regions. And they modulate memory encoding and retrieval, pattern completion, contextual association. This means that DMT consumption can modulate the hippocampus' ability to retrieve deep, emotional, significant patterns, potentially including pre-verbal or sensory motor memories. So this is something that we see with all psychedelics, but I think due to the intensity of the DMT state and the fact that it can potentially be what we get through the birthing process, that when we do DMT, those memories, those really deep memories, due to the intensity of it and due to the expression of DMT throughout the body, I think that allows us to tap into those. It brings us back to that state. So under DMT, the hippocampus could retrieve these deeply buried sensory motor patterns, could amplify or reconstruct archetypal imagery based on early sensory memory templates, and especially in conjunction with limbic structures. And these fragments might then be interpreted by the brain as elves, gestures, symbols shaped by both early memory and current cultural contexts. So just based on the neuroscience, we know that DMT interacts with the hippocampus, the thalamus, the amygdala, the default mode network, and speculatively the pineal gland. And we see that same reaction in neonatal imaging, which I think is very interesting and should be explored even more. So how can we test this, right? We can measure DMT-induced hippocampal activity via EEG and fMRI, which we are doing. We can use pattern completion tasks or memory priming pre-post DMT. We can explore overlap in hippocampal activation during DMT states, dream recall, infant memory encoding via infant EEG studies. We can correlate subjective reports of birth-like imagery with hippocampal activation strength or BDNF levels. So one thing that gets talked about is the peculiarity of DMT, the ubiquity of it, and how simple it is. So DMT is just 2 enzymatic steps from tryptophan, which is an amino acid readily available in the body. Tryptophan through decarboxylation goes to tryptamine, and tryptamine via that INMT enzyme turns to DMT. Right, so very, very simple molecule found throughout the body, not just the brain, lungs, placenta, retina, like just everywhere throughout the body. DMT is found in plants, fungi, marine life, mammals, suggesting it's nearly ubiquitous across all organic life. So this could potentially mean that DMT is a strong candidate for a primitive signaling molecule, much like serotonin and ATP, but simply but functionally potent, right? So how does this connect with origins of life, consciousness, and things of that nature? Sarah Walker has and Lee Cronin have developed this theory called cell assembly theory, and that suggests that life emerges from systems capable of storing and propagating information, not just in genetic material like DNA, but via chemical reaction networks capable of memory and computation. So could DMT act not merely as a neurotransmitter or a signaling molecule, but as a chemical glue or integrator, a molecule tagging, coordinating, and amplifying complexity in early biological systems? Some of the parallels that support this idea are DMT readily crosses membranes and the blood-brain barrier. It modulates 5-HT2A receptors, which are central to cortical network integration, plasticity, and perception. It induces neural network entropy, increasing informational complexity, possibly mirroring early prebiotic chemical exploration, right? So in short, DMT may encode or amplify complexity in the brain and hypothetically in early protocellular systems. So the idea of information theory and neuroscience and the entropic brain hypothesis is that consciousness is associated with increased informational richness, entropy in cortical networks. Psychedelics, especially DMT, elevate this entropy, possibly tapping into latent or fundamental neural states. So, if consciousness requires high network complexity and DMT helps instantiate this, it could be seen as a complex catalyst, not just in brains, but in life. Right. So the big picture here, how DMT could function in cell assembly, theory of life origins. Right. So one, it's chemical simplicity, easy to synthesize prebiotically. Tryptophan is ancient. Membrane permeability bridges compartments in cells and organelles. Receptor interaction modulates systems that encode perception, emotion, self. Ubiquity in life found across phyla, not limited to one biological kingdom. Neuroplasticity and entropy promotes adaptive flexibility and informational integration. Subjective symbolism invokes archetypes, suggesting universal neural templates. So kind of like the information, one of the things that Dr. Walker talks about is that the human being in time, when you look at the complexity and the information, all our information goes back to 4 billion years ago, and we have all this information in us. So the idea that these archetypes, these things can continue to go through and she kind of likens it to this idea that, like, when you get this idea that comes up, right? A lot of times you get the idea long before you come up with the relevance of it. And a lot of that could be due to this idea that information is stored through complexity. And then once you get to that complexity, we all have access to that information through conscious and unconscious, mostly unconscious experience. The idea that special relativity, general relativity, Einstein thought of that long before we could actually test it. Flying, like all these things, right? So what's the implication here is that DMT could be a candidate molecule that both stores and activates fundamental information structures in living systems. Philosophically, What's the implication here? So if consciousness or proto-consciousness is fundamental, um, as in idealism, the DMT might be the biological switch or the interface molecule that enables matter to participate in awareness. Again, extremely speculative. This would elevate DMT's role from neurotransmitter to cosmological molecule, a kind of consciousness key embedded in the machinery of life. Um, Therefore, consciousness is not created by the brain. Instead, it's something the brain accesses or filters, particularly at existential thresholds like birth, death, psychedelic states, which echoes Aldous Huxley's reducing valve model. Um, so consciousness is primary, matter is derivative, DMT as a gateway, not a hallucination amplifier. Um, so again, it could be a gateway, maybe not to these highly intelligent extraterrestrial dimensional states, but a gateway to consciousness. Um, so it removes the brain's ordinary filtering and opens access to more universal and symbolic field of reality. Um, and again, it treats the archetypes not as cultural byproducts, but as built-in templates of consciousness. This reflects the Jungian influence idealism. So that's philosophically, it's not necessarily that it's only idealism, but that it actually blends idealism with empirical neuroscience, a kind of neurophenomenological idealism. Just kind of reframing what it means for a molecule like DMT to reveal rather than generate certain states. So just to kind of wrap things up and kind of gather my thoughts here, what I'm proposing in this birth echo hypothesis is that endogenous DMT acts as a biochemical interface between the brain and a deeper, possibly fundamental layer of consciousness, synthesized naturally in the human body and found across diverse life forms. DMT may play a central role in shaping early neurodevelopment and transitional states of consciousness, particularly birth and death, when the boundaries of self, perception, and time are most fluid, drawn from the neuroscience, developmental psychology, psychedelic phenomena. We are stating that DMT experiences symbolically recapitulates the birthing process, reactivating latent archetypal structures encoded before the formation of the ego and autobiographical memory. This is supported by parallels between neonatal and psychedelic brain states, such as high entropy ego dissolution, sensory integration across modalities, synesthesia. We extend the idea further by integrating cell assembly theory, proposing that DMT, due to its structural simplicity, evolutionary ubiquity, and capacity to modulate high-level cortical activity, may function as a molecular scaffold for biological complexity. As life emerged from self-organizing chemical systems capable of information storage and computation, DMT may have played a role not just in consciousness, but in life itself. Its ability to promote entropy, facilitate network plasticity, engage deeply, conserved serotonin receptors suggest that DMT may serve as a biochemical bridge between matter and mind, between molecular organization and the emergence of sentient awareness. And the framework invites new directions for research, most of all at the intersection of neuroscience, origin of life studies, and consciousness science. So that's the hypothesis in a nutshell. I know it's a lot to take in, but what I would love is to hear everyone's feedback, both from the psychedelic community, from the neuroscience community, from all the communities. I'm very interested to hear what you guys think. I'm very interested to debate this idea with anyone that wants to debate it. But mostly, what I really like about it is that there's a lot of testability in it, and I think in order to ground this stuff to science, we need things that are extremely testable. So I hope that you guys enjoy this video, and I hope that it resonates with some of you, and that we can get some good discussion going on it.